Have you ever been told, I need space, and wondered if it's a healthy boundary or if they're just avoiding you? Or maybe you've set limits in a relationship and been called avoidant for it. Today, we're diving into the crucial difference between having healthy boundaries and avoidance in relationships. Because sometimes what looks like avoidance might be healthy self care, and what sounds like a boundary might actually be fear in disguise. Hi, friends, and welcome back. And if you're new here, welcome to our community. I'm Tehrina Terry.
And I'm Joel Terry.
And this is Da Vinci. We're licensed therapists with 30 years of experience between us, here to help you build healthy relationships.
We do that through teaching you the ABCs of lasting love: attachment, boundaries, and communication. And if you've ever struggled to tell whether someone's being avoidant or just setting healthy boundaries, or if you've wondered whether your own boundaries are actually avoidance, this video is for you.
Let's do it.
Before we dive in, we've created a quick boundaries versus avoidance quiz to help you discover if you're truly setting healthy boundaries or if there might be some avoidance patterns influencing your relationships. Or maybe you'll discover if anxious attachment is causing you to misinterpret others' boundaries as rejection. We'll share how to access this free quiz at the end of the video, so stay tuned.
First, let's take a moment to explain the key differences between boundaries and avoidance. Boundaries are intentional limits we set to protect our well-being. They come from a place of self-respect and self-awareness. When we set a boundary, we're saying, this is what I need to be healthy in this relationship. Avoidance, on the other hand, comes from fear. It's when we distance ourselves from relationships or situations because we're uncomfortable with vulnerability, emotional intimacy, or conflict. The key difference? Boundaries actually foster healthier connections, while avoidance leads to disconnection over time.
One of the most common scenarios we see in our practice is when someone sets a completely fair boundary, but the other person feels rejected and labels it as avoidance. Imagine this. Your friend says, I really value our friendship, but with my current work schedule, I can only meet up once a month right now. If you have anxious attachment tendencies, you might interpret this as they don't want to see me, or they're pulling away because they're avoidant. But here's the truth. Just because a boundary makes you uncomfortable doesn't mean it's avoidance. In fact, your discomfort might be telling you something about your own attachment style or expectation. When someone tells you their limits clearly and offers alternatives to maintain the connection, that's healthy boundary setting, not avoidance.
On the flip side, sometimes people use the language of boundaries to mask their avoidance. For example, someone might say, I have a boundary against discussing emotional topics, or my boundary is that I don't text back for several days. While these sound like boundaries, they might actually be avoiding the vulnerability that comes from deeper connection. Remember, true boundaries enhance relationships by creating sustainable conditions for connection. Avoidance simply shuts down possibilities for growth and intimacy. When someone's boundary seems to eliminate all forms of meaningful connection or accountability, that's usually avoidance wearing a boundary costume.
Now, here's where it gets interesting and complex. Sometimes it's not entirely one or the other. We're all works in progress. We might set boundaries that are partly about genuine self-care and partly about avoiding discomfort we're not ready to face. For instance, someone might say, I don't do phone calls. This could be a legitimate boundary based on how they process information or manage their energy. Or it could be a way to avoid the immediacy and vulnerability of real-time conversation. For example, in my 20s, I spent half a decade working in call centers where I was on the phone 40 hours a week talking to customers. Paid for undergrad, it wasn't a bad job, but after 5 years of that, I was pretty burnt out on phone calls, and I still am. So I will avoid talking on the phone if I absolutely can, unless there's a dire need for me to get on the phone. I'll text, I'll FaceTime, I'll happily spend time in person, but phone calls are kind of out of the picture now.
And what I would add to this is that for me, coming from a space of having a history of anxious attachment and having just done a lot of personal growth work toward becoming more secure before Joel and I started dating, I Never, I mean, I would say I could count on both hands the number of times after 10 years of being together, we've even spoken on the phone. And even in early dating, this didn't trigger my anxious attachment because Joel communicated this really clearly. I totally got it. I mean, I can't imagine working for a call center for so long. And so he communicated it, and he also was very available via text, and we spent a ton of time in person, which is the best. So it never triggered my anxious anxiety or my anxious attachment. And the big key is the communication.
How do you know which is which? Here are some reflection questions that can help. Does this limit support my overall well being, or is it just protecting me from discomfort I might need to work through? Am I open to discussing my needs and finding compromises? Or am I using boundaries as a conversation ender? Is this limit consistent with my values, or is it a reaction to fear?
Let's break down some clear signs that help distinguish between healthy boundaries and avoidance. First, healthy boundaries are clearly communicated, as Joel did with me in the beginning of our relationship. Someone with good boundaries will tell you directly what they need rather than just disappearing or acting distant. Second, healthy boundaries are consistent, not situational. They're based on personal values and needs, not just reactions to discomfort. Third, when someone has healthy boundaries, they're still open to connection, just in ways that work for them. They might say, I can't meet tonight, but let's plan for next week. Or, I'd prefer texting over calling, but I'd love to catch up. Fourth, healthy boundaries preserve relationships rather than end them. They create sustainable conditions for connection. And fifth, healthy boundaries come from a place of emotional regulation, not reaction. They're not about punishing others, but caring for yourself.
In contrast, avoidance often looks like avoiding conversations instead of communicating clearly. Someone who's avoidant might say, I'm just busy. When you ask what's wrong, they continue pulling away. Avoidance is based in fear or discomfort, not genuine needs. It's about avoiding intimacy, conflict, or vulnerability rather than protecting your energy. And avoidance is often inconsistent and selective. Someone might engage deeply when it's convenient, but withdraw when emotions get involved. A classic sign of avoidance is the push pull dynamic, creating distance when things get close and then returning when you start pulling away. With avoidance, there's no room for negotiation. You'll hear things like, that's just how I am, instead of explanations or compromises. And finally, avoidance is often used as an excuse to avoid responsibility. It's just my boundary becomes a way to escape accountability for how their own actions affect others.
Now, what if you recognize that you or someone in your life might be in that gray area, having some legitimate boundaries, but also some avoidance tendencies? First, that's completely normal. Most of us aren't purely in one category. Second, this is where self awareness becomes so important. Notice if you set boundaries but feel guilty about them, feel unsure whether you're protecting yourself or avoiding discomfort, have very strict boundaries in some areas but struggle to maintain any in others. These might indicate you're working through a mix of healthy boundary setting and some avoidance patterns. Some key questions to ask yourself are, am I doing this to take care of myself or just to avoid an uncomfortable conversation? Is this about my energy level or am I just afraid of getting close?
Whether you tend more towards anxious attachment and might misinterpret boundaries as rejection, or avoidant attachment and might use boundaries to keep distance, here are some steps to build healthier relationships. If you tend to feel rejected by others' boundaries, practice seeing boundaries as a sign of self awareness, not rejection. Ask yourself, what's being triggered in me right now? Respect that different people have different needs for connection. If you tend to avoid connection under the guise of boundaries, challenge yourself to distinguish between discomfort and genuine needs. Practice small steps towards vulnerability. Be honest with yourself about your patterns. And for everyone, communicate your needs clearly and directly. Be open to discussing and negotiating boundaries, with the caveat that negotiating boundaries is different from not respecting boundaries.
Mhm.
And if you'd like more clarity on this difference, let us know in the comments and we'll create a video dedicated to this. Remember that healthy boundaries should ultimately support connection, not prevent it.
The difference between boundaries and avoidance often comes down to intention and impact. Boundaries come from self respect and foster healthy relationships. Avoidance comes from fear and creates distance over time. Remember that quiz we mentioned at the beginning? Take our boundaries and attachment styles quiz by clicking on the link in the description and discover which animal archetype matches your relationship patterns. Are you a balanced cat, a loyal dog, a self protected turtle, or a cautious hedgehog? This 5-minute assessment will reveal how you set boundaries and respond to others' boundaries, offering insights based on attachment theory. Once you complete this quiz, you'll receive personalized strategies tailored to your specific animal archetype to help you create healthier relationships.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. Have you ever had your boundaries misinterpreted as avoidance, or realized that what you thought was a boundary was actually avoidance? Share your experiences in the comments below. And while you're working on building healthier relationships, don't forget to download our free relationship guide that helps you identify your must-haves and deal breakers. This guide pairs perfectly with the quiz results to give you clarity on your boundaries and recognize when they're coming from a healthy place. All of the links are in the description below.
Subscribe and take care of your heart.
And remember, you're not alone. We're all in this
Together.